came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush, it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left, it held a whip of many thongs. Hello everybody, welcome to Aude and Tulva, where we are walking our way through Tolkien's Legendarium. Today we're on Book 2, Chapter 5 of the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. Don't forget to check the description where I've linked a few of my favorite covers of different price points, and we've opened up memberships on the channel where you'll get early access to videos, members-only community posts, if you'd like to help support what we're doing here. All right, let's dive in. We drove the orcs from the great gate and guard. We slew many in the bright sun in the dale. Floey was killed by an arrow. He slew the great Floey under grass near Miramir. We have taken the 21st Hall of North End to dwell in. Balin is now Lord of Moria. Owen to seek for the upper armories of Third Deep. Go westwards to Howland Gate. Sorrow. Day being the 10th of November, Balin, Lord of Moria, fell in Dimrill Dale. He went alone to look in Miramir, and orc shot him from behind a stone. We slew the orc, but many more. Up from east, up the Silverload. We have barred the gates. Can hold them long if. Horrible. Suffer. We cannot get out. We cannot get out. They have taken the bridge and second hall. Frar and Loni and Nali fell there 5 days ago. The pool is up to the wall at Westgate. The watcher in the water took Owen. We cannot get out. The end comes. Drums. Drums in the deep. They are coming. It seems the company has found the last of Balin's group of dwarves that went off to recolonize Moria. Reading just the words of the Book of Mazarbel really gives their plight a whole new horror to it. The fear they must have felt, the determination to hold against all odds, transforming into perhaps hopelessness, all while seeing your friends dying beside you. I don't think Tolkien meant this to directly parallel anything he experienced in World War I necessarily, but I can see how he's definitely pulling from his own experience. I still think Sauron planted the seed of Moria into the ranks of the dwarves in Erebor. It's enough reason for me to see that he got rid of a bunch of dwarves before the actual War of the Rings started. But what solidifies it for me is something I literally just noticed as I was writing this. Orcs came up to Silverload, which flows from the eastern gate of Moria down the mountains to the east. Why would orcs be coming from that direction if not sent by Sauron? Not to mention, we'll see mention of Uruks from Mordor. This was, in my opinion, just kind of long play from Sauron. As the company begins to move after reading the harrowing tale of Balin's company, we learn that Pippin's impulse control may have severe consequences. We begin with Gandalf. Come now, back to the hall. Gandalf had hardly spoken these words when there came a great noise, a rolling boom that seemed to come from depths far below and to tremble in the stone at their feet. They sprang towards the door in alarm. Doom, doom, it rolled again, as if huge hands were turning the very caverns of Moria into a vast drum. Then there came an echoing blast. A great horn was blown in the hall, and answering horns and harsh cries were heard further off. There was a hurrying sound of many feet. They are coming, cried Legolas. We cannot get out, said Gimli. First, I love how at the end, Legolas and Gimli echo the end of the Book of Mazarbel. It makes me wonder if the orcs caught Balin's company by surprise in the same way at the end. But this all started with Pippin's lack of self-restraint. Had he not wondered how deep the well was, maybe they would have just been able to sneak all the way through without being discovered. If you don't recall what happened in the last chapter to cause those drums to roll through Moria, check out last week's video here. But in this case, Pippin did what he did, and it seems they'll just kind of have to fight their way through. Another harsh horn call and shrill cries rang out. Feet were coming down the corridor. There was a ring and clatter as the company drew their swords. Glamdring shone with a pale light, and Sting glinted at the edges. Boromir set his shoulder against the western door. This is as good a time as any to stop for a second and talk about Sting and Glamdring. Back in the Ringo South, Bilbo buries Sting into a wooden beam with ease. And here we learn they both are shining or glowing or something. Glamdring shining with a pale light and Sting glinting around the edges. There's no real information on why they would shine with light. Sting is mentioned in the prologue, but not by name. We learn in The Hobbit that Glamdring and Sting were made by the elves in the first age in the city of Gondolin. Elrond even tells them Glamdring was worn by the king of Gondolin. This, Gandalf, was Glamdring, foehammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. We know from the Silmarillion that Turgon was the king of Gondolin, and in Unfinished Tales, in the notes after of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin, we get a description. Turgon himself would appear tallest of all the children of the world save Thingol, with a white and gold sword in a rule-bone ivory sheath, and welcome Tuor. So Gandalf's blade has quite the lineage. Frodo's sword, we must remember, is essentially a dagger for someone like Turgon, but since Frodo's a hobbit, it's, a sword. Bilbo discovers the sword shines while he's under the Misty Mountains. Combine that with the ease into which Bilbo slides it into the wood, and our next passage, Boromir leaped forward and hewed at the arm with all his might, but his sword rang, glanced aside, and fell from his shaken hand. The blade was notched. Suddenly, and to his own surprise, Frodo felt a hot wrath blaze up in his heart. "The Shire!" he cried, and springing beside Boromir, he stooped and stabbed with Sting at the hideous foot. There was a bellow, and the foot jerked back, nearly wrenching Sting from Frodo's arm. Black drops dripped from the blade and smoked on the floor. Boromir hurled himself against the door and slammed it again. "One for the Shire!" cried Aragorn. "The hobbit's bite is deep. You have a good blade, Frodo, son of Drogo." So Frodo's sword is also from Gondolin. It's thousands of years old and was carried by a powerful Noldor elf. And we notice that Boromir's blade came away notched. I doubt the Gondorian smiths are terrible at what they do, but Gondolin was just a whole different level of smithing. As the fight continues, it wanes and it seems the company will have a chance to leave through the back door. But even as they retreated and before Pippin and Merry had reached the stair outside, a huge Orc Chieftain, almost man-high, clad in black mail from head to foot, leaped into the chamber. Behind him, his followers clustered in the doorway. His broad, flat face was swart, his eyes were like coals, and his tongue was red. He wielded a great spear. With a thrust of his huge hide shield, he turned Boromir's sword and bore him backwards, throwing him to the ground. Diving under Aragorn's blow with the speed of a striking snake, he charged into the company and thrust with his spear straight at Frodo. The blow caught him on the right side, and Frodo was hurled against the wall and pinned. Sam, with a cry, hacked at the spear shaft, and it broke. But even as the orc flung down the truncheon and swept out his scimitar, Anduril came down upon his helm. There was a flash-like flame, and the helm burst asunder. The orc fell with cloven head. His followers fled howling as Boromir and Aragorn sprang at them. This is an interesting section as it shows us a couple things when paired with what we've already read. First, this huge Orc Chieftain gives us some clues about orcs. We can go back a couple paragraphs, and Gandalf talks about black Uruks of Mordor. In Hamon and Skull's Companion, we are reminded that Tolkien mentions Uruks in Appendix A as black orcs of great strength. And they further surmise that because the orc that attacks Frodo is mentioned to be almost man-high, we can assume most orcs are actually quite a bit shorter, since it's also described as huge. This isn't a supremely important bit of information, but I kind of like to point out because it helps at least me picture everything in my head better. I basically create like a movie in my head as I read, just have it kind of going. And I want it to be accurate. Dang it. The other thing this section reminds us is that Sauron knew Bilbo had the ring, was friendly with the dwarves of Erebor, and was west of the Misty Mountains. I just figured out Sauron sent orcs to Moria to kill the dwarves there after he baited them to try and reclaim it, and since we've all read the book already, we know Gollum was already captured and released by Sauron after being interrogated. It stands to reason then, at some point, Sauron sent messages to Moria letting them know to be on the lookout for short people who might have something that he needs. Now, I don't think the orc was drawn to Frodo because of the power of the ring like I do the Watcher, at least in the same way. I can't really say why I feel that. It just doesn't quite feel right. I think it goes straight for Frodo because Sauron told them to. This next part is really interesting to me though. Again, I never caught it until I was literally reviewing the chapter to talk about it. Aragorn picks Frodo up and starts to carry him out of the room, thinking him dead. "I am all right," gasped Frodo. "I can walk, put me down." Aragorn nearly dropped him in his amazement. "I thought you were dead," he cried. "Not yet," said Gandalf, "but there is no time for wonder. Off you go, all of you, down the stairs. Wait a few minutes for me at the bottom, but if I do not come soon, go on. Go quickly and choose paths leading right and downwards. We cannot leave you to hold the door alone," said Aragorn. "Do as I say," said Gandalf fiercely. "Swords are no more use here. Go." So what's so interesting about this little section? Throughout the book, Gandalf has been a helper. He's been working alongside people, giving them information, helping them along to the right decision. The chapter on Istari and Unfinished Tales gives us some information about the wizards also. Whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty or to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. And last came one who seemed the least, less tall than the others, and in looks more aged, gray-haired and gray-clad, and leaning on a staff. But Círdan, from their first meeting at the Grey Havens, divined in him the greatest spirit and the wisest, and he welcomed him with reverence, and he gave to his keeping the third ring, Narya the Red. For, he said, great labors and perils lie before you, and lest your task prove too great and wearisome, take this ring for your aid and comfort. It was entrusted to me only to keep secret, and here upon the west shores it is idle. But I deem that in days ere long to come it should be in nobler hands than mine, that may wield it for the kindling of all hearts to courage. The most important part of our discussion here is the fact that the Istari were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty or seek to rule the will of elves or men with open displays of power. And everything we've seen of Gandalf until now has fit that line. We haven't really seen him do much in terms of power. We've seen him work with Aragorn, but not command anyone. They've had discussions. They've tried Aragorn's way first over the mountains. He's never exercised his authority, even though I think you can argue he has more than anyone else, even Aragorn. But when he tells the company to go, he's very commanding. Do as I say, Gandalf said fiercely. This is one of the rare times we see Gandalf start to really be who he is, and I think it's super, super cool. And I also think that his ring is working. Given to him when Círdan met him upon landing on Middle-earth, it was to kindle hearts to courage. And maybe that's what we see when Frodo attacks the troll. Tolkien even said Frodo was surprised to find his hot wrath blazing up in his heart. The ring was to kindle courage. Frodo's wrath blazed. Knowing how particular Tolkien was about his word usage, I would have a pretty hard time saying he didn't mean for us to eventually learn why Frodo felt so courageous at that point. But to me, that makes Gandalf's command even stronger. He works in subtle and convincing and encouraging ways. He's not demanding or commanding, but here he yells at Aragorn and the rest to leave so he can work his magic. Maybe even so he can be alone to cast his spells of shutting on the door without the others seeing such obvious use or displays of magic or power. Perhaps that was part of him being forbidden to show others his power. I mean, I don't know. It's super cool. I love it. It's just layer after layer in this one. It's so fun. Well, they listen to Gandalf and move down the steps. Gandalf stands guard by the door alone. Suddenly, at the top of the stair, there was a stab of white light. Then there was a dull rumble and a heavy thud. The drum beats broke out wildly. Doom, boom, and then stopped. Gandalf came flying down the steps and fell to the ground in the midst of the company. Well, that's over, said the wizard, struggling to his feet. I have done all that I could, but I have met my match and have nearly been destroyed. But don't stand here, go on. You'll have to do without light for a while. I am rather shaky. So Gandalf is almost destroyed. And here we have just another, almost textual ruin from Tolkien. Not a ruin exactly, but anyway. Why does Gandalf use the word destroyed rather than killed? Well, one, can he even be killed? Gandalf himself hints that he may not be able to be killed, at least in the same sense that men can be. He's a Maya after all. So his vessel, his body, can be destroyed, but his spirit will survive. I think it's safe to assume that's kind of what he thinks and what he's saying. So his foe could destroy his body, but his consciousness, his spirit, who he is, would still be intact. Maybe he would be called to the halls of Mandos like the elves were, his Heroa body destroyed. Maybe he could just chill as his spirit back in Valinor. It's all clearly conjecture. I have no knowledge of anything to come. So moving forward, the company works their way down the stairs and they seem to be in the final stretch. Legolas turned and set an arrow to the string. Though it was a long shot for his small bow, he drew, but his hand fell and the arrow slipped to the ground. He gave a cry of dismay and fear. Two great trolls appeared. They bore great slabs of stone and flung them down to serve as gangways over the fire. But it was not the trolls that had filled the elf with terror. The ranks of orcs had opened and they crowded away as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow in the middle of which was a dark form, of man-shaped maybe, yet greater. And a power and terror seemed to be in it and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire and light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush, it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left, it held a whip of many thongs. Now, this is just about one of the coolest descriptions in this book. It's so evocative and primal feeling. The Balrog, of course, is a Maya like Gandalf. In Sindarin, it means demon of might, and they are noted in the Silmarillion as Maya who were attracted to Melkor by his splendor in the days of his greatness, and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness. Or, whom he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous fights. Dread among these spirits were the Valaraukar, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. Initially, Tolkien had hundreds of Balrogs in Morgoth's service, but we find in Morgoth's Ring, which is volume 10 of History of Middle-earth, that he changed the number to 3 or no more than 7. Morgoth's Ring is basically all changes Tolkien was making to the early Legendarium in his work to publish the Silmarillion. So basically, as he was writing The Lord of the Rings, he realized that Balrog was like uber powerful, so there could really only be a few of them. And in Appendix A, Tolkien says of the dwarves of Moria, thus they roused from sleep a thing of terror that, flying from Thangorodrim, had lain hidden at the foundations of the earth since the coming of the hosts of the west, it Balrog of Morgoth. All of which leads us to the main question in everybody's heads. Do Balrogs have wings? Let's see why some people say that they do have wings. In The Lord of the Rings, his enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. Also, it stepped forward slowly to the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. And of course, we just mentioned it flying from Thangorodrim. And then again in Morgoth's Ring, swiftly they arose, and they passed with winged speed over Hithlum, and they came to Lamoth as a tempest of fire. I mean, it seems like it could even be pretty conclusive. Tolkien even wrote, its wings were spread from wall to wall. But it's pretty clear he's using like a simile or metaphor here. He says shadows spread out like 2 wings. So when referencing the wings a couple sentences later, I feel it's safe to assume he means the shadows. Yeah. Next, when Tolkien uses the word fly, it's most often in regards to moving swiftly. A couple paragraphs later, Gandalf will even say, "Fly, you fools." There's nothing you can say that will convince me that he wants them to spawn wings and start flying in the air, though it probably, honestly, would have been pretty helpful. In the Silmarillion, Glorfindel defeats a Balrog when they both fall off a cliff and die. The Balrog had wings, wouldn't he have just, flown away? And the author of Tolkien Gateways page makes a pretty interesting observation. If we take the line about the Balrog flying from Thangorodrim literally, that the Balrog used wings to fly, then we would have to take every reference of the word fly literally. Like when Gandalf came flying down the steps and fell to the ground. I think you can tell. I'm firmly in the camp of no wings, not even vestigial wings. I think the way John Howe drew the Balrog with wings and the way it was animated in the Jackson films was freaking awesome looking, but still inaccurate. I'd love to hear actually what you guys think about this, age-old question down below. But back to the actual chapter, Gandalf and the Balrog meet in the middle of the bridge and we get to hear Gandalf. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." Now, we talked about the use of the word cannot in the Council of Elrond. If you haven't watched those videos, check out that playlist here. In short, when the cannot in use, it means just that, like cannot. It's not a moral shouldn't or anything like that. It really means the lack of ability to do something. Contrary to the movies, Gandalf isn't telling Balrog that he shall not pass, that he's going to thwart his passing if he can. No, Gandalf is making a statement that it is literally impossible for the Balrog to pass Gandalf. But what about the Flame of Anor? What does that mean? Well, in the Silmarillion, after the music was ended, Eru sent the flame imperishable to the void, and the world was created. Later in the Silmarillion, it is referred to as the secret fire. In Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien says, flame imperishable appears to mean the creative activity of Eru, in some sense distinct from or within him, by which things could be given a real and independent, though derivative and created, existence. Melkor himself even searched for the flame because he wanted to create things for himself. Then Melkor turned Morgoth, created Udun, his dwelling beneath Thangorodrim. This is where he made his creations, bad, tortured copies of things Eru had made. Gandalf here is telling the Balrog that he holds the true power, whereas the Balrog holds a copy. Gandalf claims to wield the power of creation itself. An imitation cannot begin to compete. Now, I encourage you all to take a few minutes and read this whole section, the contest between Gandalf and the Balrog, out loud. It's an amazing section. Now, as we all know by now, Gandalf is pulled down by the Balrog's whip into the abyss. And as the company follow his last command and fly on their feet, to be specific, away from the orcs, Tolkien hammers home what just happened. They looked back. Dark yawned the archway of the gates under the mountain shadow. Faint and far beneath the earth rolled the slow drum beats. Doom. A thin black smoke trailed out. Nothing else was to be seen. The dale all around was empty. Doom. Grief at last wholly overcame them, and they wept long. Some standing and silent, some cast upon the ground. Doom. Doom. The drum beats faded. The company is one less. Gandalf is gone. Who will lead them now? Reading this for the first time was devastating, but there is still lots of book left and lots of walking to get through yet. So we'll pick back up next week with the beginning of the chapter of Lothlorien. Thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, memberships are open if you'd like to help support the channel that way. And until next time, out in Tulava, they shall come again.